My name is Joanne Uy. I'm the producer of Freedom and Transformation Ideas Festival. Welcome to day 2 of the festival, which follows on our day yesterday in Durrës, which was a glorious triumph with some of the world's top thought leaders and authors on some very important subjects. We expect more of the same today. First, I want to take a moment to thank all of our supporters, sponsors, and partners. MECI, the British Council, the British Embassy, the municipalities of Tirana and Durrës, Vodafone, and Tirana Creative Industries. Next, I wanted to say what a great project and invention the International Cultural Weeks are. They are an indicator of the country's commitment to art and culture and the power of art and culture to invigorate the economy and transform society. Other nations, including even the UK, could take a leaf out of Albania's playbook and follow its lead when it comes to art and culture. But without further ado, I want to introduce our first session. Christina Lamb, one of the world's most intrepid and influential war journalists, and the UK's new ambassador to Albania, Nicholas Abbott. Please give them a warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here. It's really an honor and a privilege to welcome Christina to Albania and to the session today. She is a writer and a journalist. She's currently the chief foreign editor for the Sunday Times. She's received 18 major awards, an OBE for services to journalism. She's written 10 books, including co-writing I Am Malala with Malala Yousafzai. Today we're going to talk about women and war, but I would also like to talk particularly about your book, Christina, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. And I should perhaps say at the start that some of this will be uncomfortable. Having read the book myself, these are, as you say, dark stories. But stories that need to see the light, if I can say that. Could I perhaps start by asking you what motivated you in this book, but also in the reporting that you've done around war and the effect that it has on women?
Sure, thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for coming. It's such a glorious, sunny Sunday lunchtime. I'm not sure I'd want to be inside, but so I really appreciate you coming here, and I really appreciate the organisers for arranging such a nice event. So, how did I get started on this? Well, I have been covering war for 36 years, and when I first started, there weren't that many other women war journalists. So without really thinking about it, I was always most interested in what happened to women in war, and much less interested in what I call the bang-bang, the sort of fighting, which is usually men. So to me, how people keep their lives together when there's a war, how they educate their children, feed them, protect them, shelter the elderly, is much more interesting than really what's going on the front lines. And I've spent a lot of time recently in Ukraine, and you think about it being at war, but there are millions of people still going to work, getting married, going to cafes, going to talks. They even have a literary festival, which I was very pleased to speak at last year. So that's always been my great interest, and you don't see any statues to these women, but to me they are the real heroes in war. However, there is a dark side, and the dark side is the use of sexual violence in war rape, which unfortunately we see in just about every conflict. I first became really aware of this, I would say exactly 10 years ago. And you might remember the Chibok girls in Nigeria who had been kidnapped from their school in the middle of the night, more than 250 girls, and taken by Boko Haram fighters into the Sambisa forest it became the biggest story on earth for like 2 weeks. Everybody went there to report on it. You had people like Michelle Obama holding up these, doing selfies with this hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. And it was a major story. And then everyone went away. And I started traveling in that area to try and understand what was going on, and quickly discovered that the Chibok girls were just the tip of the iceberg, that actually thousands of girls and women had been taken by Boko Haram. So I was reporting on that. Then shortly after that, you might remember in August 2014, Islamic State fighters went into northern Iraq to a place where the Yazidis live, Shingal, and killed a lot of men and elderly and kidnapped thousands of Yazidi women and girls and took them as sex slaves. So I met some of these Yazidis who'd managed to escape and had fled to a Greek island called Leros, and they were refugees. And I had no idea what had happened to them. At that point, we didn't know much about what had happened to the Yazidi women. So I met them, I was talking to them. It was clear that something absolutely terrible had happened to them. They just had, all the light had gone out of their eyes. Some of them had children, and where I met them was in a kind of ruined mental asylum. The kids were kind of almost falling down through some of the broken floorboards, and yet the women weren't really taking any notice of what were happening. It was like they were just completely disconnected from everything. And eventually one of them told me that they had all been taken by Islamic State and taken to a place called Galaxy Cinema, which was like a kind of slave market where they were separated according to whether they were considered ugly or beautiful or in between. And these fighters would then come, touch their hair, touch their breasts, and decide which one they wanted to take. So I was horrified. I'd never heard stories like this. And then they told me that others of them had escaped and had gone to Germany, so I went and interviewed some of them too. And each case, both Nigeria and the Yazidis, we were talking about thousands of women, and they were talking about what had happened to them. Then 3 years after that, 2017, I was in Bangladesh because the Rohingya people were being driven out of their homes in Burma or Myanmar by the Burmese military and Buddhist militias, and around 700,000 people fled into Bangladesh in about 3 months. Mostly they were women, children, elderly. And one woman after another told me about how they'd been dragged from their hut, tied to banana trees and gang raped, often in front of their children. I mean, absolutely horrific stories. Again, thousands of women. So I'm reporting all these things. First of all, it was difficult to report because, frankly, my foreign editor, who was male, said to me, nobody wants to read these stories. And I became very cross about it because I said, look, just because these are uncomfortable stories doesn't mean we shouldn't run them. Of course, on the contrary, if you don't expose what's happening, nothing will change. Fortunately, my paper also has a magazine, and that was run by a woman who was very much behind these stories. So I was able to write about them, but it was difficult. Nobody much was reporting a lot of these things.
Well, this is something else that I picked up, is you clearly describe, you witness what has happened to these women. And you know, there are some very detailed descriptions about the impact that it has had on them physically, the impact that it's had on them I would argue spiritually, their own sense of worth. But what struck me as well is that there are different geographies, but a shared suffering.
Yes, there certainly is. And I mean, just to finish that story, basically, one of the ways my job has changed enormously since I started was communication. So late 80s when I started, no mobile phones, no internet. I used to have to file by telex, which probably lots of people here don't even remember, and also or dictating copy. And so now I can file from anywhere. I can file from the top of a mountain in the Hindu Kush. I can file from the middle of a desert in Iraq. And so that's totally changed the job in many ways. But what it also means is I stay in touch with almost everybody I've interviewed. And so I'm always like, I did an interview yesterday or 2 days ago with the Venezuelan opposition leader who's in hiding. You know, she's messaging me today, thanking for the interview. Now, years ago, that wouldn't have happened. I mean, the only way you would have stayed in touch would have been to write a letter, which would have been a bit odd. So one of these very young Yazidi girls, 16-year-old, who'd gone through this terrible ordeal, messaged me one day on WhatsApp, and she said, "We told our story. What difference did it make?" And I thought about it. And I always feel like I do this job as a foreign correspondent because I'm trying to fight against injustice. I feel that if I expose these stories, somebody will do something about it, which is idealistic. I mean, lots of times, unfortunately, nothing happens. And in this case, I thought, nothing has happened, actually. And I started looking into it, and I realized that in all those cases, the Yazidis, the Rohingya, the girls taken by Boko Haram, not a single person had been prosecuted. Nobody had been brought to justice. And yet, as she said, we told our story. It wasn't that nobody knew. And I was kind of horrified. And then I started looking into the whole issue much more. Why is this happening in conflicts? And started to go to other places and also look into the history of it. And again, initially, when I talked to people about collecting the accounts together and writing a book about it, some people said to me, why would you write a book about it? There's always been rape in war. I mean, go back to the ancient Greeks, Persians, and Romans. And I'm like, well, yeah, but we're in, 2020, 2024. It shouldn't be happening today. And so that's why I decided to put a whole lot of stories together and still keep writing about it.
Yeah, and that, because you talk about those different places, yet the experiences are very much the same. Those experiences suffering are very much the same. Where do you think that leads us in terms of our response to it?
Well, first of all, I mean, all of the women that I interviewed, and so I went to 12 different countries. I think sometimes people think, oh, this is something that happens far away, I don't know, in the Democratic Republic of Congo or northern Iraq. It's not. And, we know here, right? It happened in Kosovo, exactly. It happened in Bosnia, now it's happening in Ukraine. This isn't something that happens far away or is a particular religion or something. Every religion has been guilty of doing this. Every country where there's a conflict, it seems to happen. And so all of the women and girls I spoke to, I said to them, what do you want to happen? And everybody said they wanted justice. Now, I think justice means different things to different people. It doesn't necessarily mean being in court in front of your perpetrator and seeing them taken away in handcuffs. To some people, I think it just meant acknowledgement of what happened to them. And in some ways, one of the most moving stories I heard was going to the Philippines and meeting some of the women who had been taken during the Second World War by the Japanese, Imperial Japanese Army as so-called comfort women, and taken, when they were 13 or 14, some of them not even had reached puberty. Terrible things that happened to them. And then after the war, they couldn't talk about it because it was seen as shame. And so for years, decades, they stayed silent. Finally, one woman, Rosa, spoke about it on the radio. and others heard and started to come forward. But, I mean, these women now are in their late 80s. There's very few of them left. They know that they'll die without ever seeing justice. And in the Philippines, in their history books, it's not even acknowledged what happened to them. And the women raised money to have a statue on Manila Bay in memory of the Comfort Women. And their government took it down within 4 months because they don't want to offend the Japanese, who they get money from. So it's very, very difficult. And I feel like we, the international community, has a real onus here to try and help, because justice doesn't happen by accident. And the women have done their part. They're coming forward. They're telling their stories. These are really difficult stories to tell. And yet we're not doing our part. We're just letting them say, but not doing anything to help them for the most part.
So coming back to that issue of stigma and what we can do, where do you think it starts? I mean, obviously in the book, you just quoted, there are individuals who stand up and say what happened. But what can we do in that situation to affect it? So,
because it's very easy, I do it all the time, to write about what's wrong, but not what we could do. And stigma, I mean, to me, one of the most heartbreaking things about this is that most of these people who have had a terrible wrong done to them are made to feel that they did something wrong. We all know that rape is the one crime where the victim is often made to feel shame. And so I think that is an area where it's much easier to do something. So, community leaders, faith leaders of those communities to say, no, these women did nothing wrong. They're heroes. Something bad was done to them. But it is difficult, and a lot of effort was put on trying to get Baba Sheikh, the Yazidi spiritual leader, to say that these women actually were heroes and should be welcomed back into the community, and that it was a good thing to marry one of these women, which was good. But what he didn't say was anything about the children. And a lot of these women, of course, had children with their ISIS captors. And the children can't come back, absolutely can't come back, because they're regarded as Muslims by the Yazidis, and they won't take them into their community. There's absolutely no way they will. And so these poor women are basically having to make this terrible choice about either staying with the Islamic State fighters in these horrible camps in northeast Syria, or sometimes have escaped to Turkey, or leaving their children behind and going back to Iraq. Nobody should have to make that choice.
Do you think reporting has changed?
Yeah, reporting has changed. I mean, like I told you, when I first started reporting, I was struggling to report it. Now, I think what changed it was Ukraine. So, I mean, it's very sad to me that I keep having to, I'm having to update this book already because of Ukraine and then Israel, Gaza, because it keeps happening in other places. But when the Russians left Irpin and Bucha at the end of March 2 years ago, having occupied them for the first month or so of the war, and we all went in and started hearing these terrible stories of the torture and killing that had happened under occupation. And some of those stories were about rape, women that were raped. And for the first time, it was widely reported, and also, really, I think for the first time too, Zelensky spoke about the rape on the same level as the killing and the torture. To me, one of the problems, it just feels like rape is not taken as seriously, even though it is a war crime. So at the end of wars, when you have negotiations, it's usually men sitting around the table, and they don't think about this as a major issue. They think it's a side issue. And so they don't actually involve it in the negotiations in the way that they should. So it was very important that Zelensky spoke about it openly. Having said that. Ukraine is a very conservative country. Many of the women feel they will be blamed if they speak out. So although several thousand women called the hotline, only, I think, about 160 have actually reported officially. So, and that's because, also, it's not just that they feel that their communities will look at them and as if they have something to be ashamed of, but also they don't believe that anything will happen. So there's no point in going. And they have some reason, you know, to think that, because I'm afraid I can, you know, count on a few hands the number of cases that have actually been brought to justice in the last few years.
Well, that brings us on to justice. I mean, you know, gosh, 10 years ago we had the UK very much put a lot of emphasis with our Foreign Secretary William Hague behind preventing sexual violence in conflict. And the moments that you note in the book around justice, around there being some justice process, it seems to me is almost temporary. You don't have a sense of continuity in addressing the issue.
Yeah, so, I mean, the few cases that have been successfully brought to justice have almost always involved the survivors having to testify over and over again, which is absolutely outrageous, or, you know, having the women in Bosnia, for example. I was under the impression that Bosnia was sort of a more successful case because there was so much reporting then on what had happened and the rape camps and things. I thought a lot of people had been brought to justice by the International Tribunal. When I went there and talked to the women, they said, no, we see the perpetrators all the time. We see them, they're still working in the police force, or we see them in the coffee shop. And so one amazing group, association of women survivors there, actually got together, and they themselves have tracked down a lot of the men and brought them to justice themselves. And about 100. Now, that's amazing, but women shouldn't have to do that, right? No. And if you look, the cases that have been successful internationally have almost always had a woman judge, which can't be a coincidence. The very, very first time that rape was prosecuted as an international war crime was not Bosnia, but Rwanda, and it was the International Tribunal in Arusha, and it was a mayor called Jean-Paul Akayesu. And actually that case at the beginning didn't have rape as one of the charges. It was torture and killing. And then one of the women who went to testify, she then started saying, oh, yeah, and then they raped us. So one of the male judges, the international judges, literally said to her, well, we're not interested in that, like, moving on. Fortunately, there was a female judge from South Africa, Navi Pillay, and she said, hang on a minute, this woman's come all the way here to tell her story. The least we can do is listen to her. So she said, you know, what do you mean then they raped us? So the woman said, well, they were raping everybody. They were bringing them all into the town hall and raping lots of women. And so they stopped the case and went back and researched and then added rape as one of the charges. And so he was then convicted of that. But, you know, if it hadn't been for that woman judge saying that, and by the way, you know, the perpetrators who were imprisoned there were given HIV drugs. The women who they had raped were not given them. So, you know, there's a lot of problems still. But there is one beacon of hope, and that is the use of universal jurisdiction to prosecute. So, which basically means that for war crimes, any nation can prosecute somebody from any other nation. It doesn't have to be a crime that happened in their country or by one of their citizens. So Germany, amazingly, has really led the way on this, and they carried out 3 years ago now, the first prosecution, successful prosecution for what happened to the Yazidis, and have convicted a man and his wife for, I mean, it actually wasn't for the rape, it was for killing one of the children, but they're now prosecuting a number of other people, and they're really showing the way. And I wish that the UK would follow suit, because I do think this is the way to go.
Because it seems to me there is this issue around impunity as well.
Yes,
really
I mean,
plays
this
out.
is the problem, that at the moment, nobody feels, why is it happening everywhere? Because nobody feels there's any price to pay. First of all, sadly, it's a very effective weapon if you want to drive people out of an area. So, for example, you know, it's being used in a similar way in many countries around the world, but for different reasons. Sometimes it's to try and change the ethnic balance, sometimes it's to try and humiliate your enemy, sometimes it's for economic reasons. So in Democratic Republic of Congo, there's lots of lucrative minerals that militias want to get hold of, and they want to drive the local populations out of those areas so that they can get those things. These are things like tantalus that we use in our mobile phones or laptops. And so a fighter there said to me that rape is the cheapest weapon. He said it's cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. And of course it's cheap because nobody is being brought to justice. So if you could make it that people were actually brought to justice, the International Criminal Court in more than 20 years has only successfully prosecuted one person for this crime.
As I said to you earlier, one would like to come full circle around or through an arc of all of that suffering to a point where we could talk about healing. But I don't really think one can, having read your book. I mean, this is not even about recovery. For many of the women, it's about simply surviving.
Yeah, I don't think you can ever get over or forget. It is learning to live with it. And there are some amazing projects around the world, but they're small, and there is no one organization sort of working on this as an umbrella organization, which is a shame. There are some, I mean, my book is difficult to read. It's kind of weird writing a book where you can't say to people, I hope you enjoy the book. But I feel like these women had tremendous courage to tell their stories, and the least we can do is listen to them or read them. But there are also some heroes in the book, and some of them are men. And my own personal hero is a man called Denis Mukwege in Eastern Congo, who is a gynecologist, set up a hospital which has treated, I believe, more rape victims than anywhere on earth. They've treated 55,000 women. And he's very despondent, actually, because he says he's now, the same people he's treated are coming back again, and also the next generation, so the children of the women. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago jointly with Nadia Murad, the Yazidi woman, for this issue. And so at that time, that seemed like a really positive thing. And that the world was really kind of taking notice of this. But unfortunately, Dr. Mukwege said to me, and I encourage you, if you Google and see the speech he gave in Oslo, it was so powerful. And he, reminds us that we are every day using things like iPhones, which are using minerals coming from these places where the women have been raped so they can get a hold of them. So he made this very powerful speech. But he said to me, at the end, it didn't make any difference. And he said, I didn't do all of this to try and win a Nobel Prize. I wanted to change things.
So what do you think will make a difference?
I think, prosecuting people, but the international community needs to be really serious about that. It's no good. I mean, the UN passed a resolution. Every member state supported it more than 20 years ago. Resolution 1325, which says that we must do more to curb sexual violence in conflict, but we must also increase female participation in peacekeeping and peace negotiations, because the two things are very much related. Like I said, it can't be a coincidence that the few successful cases of prosecution have had women judges. And like the late Supreme Court Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, I believe that women belong in all the places where decisions are being made. And at the moment, that isn't the case. And if you look at UN peacekeepers, I think 5% now are female. So there's a lot to do of trying to increase female participation in these things. And I do think if, you know, there isn't a single peace negotiation in the world at the moment where, I mean, not that there's sadly that many peace negotiations happening now. Things are going the other way. But there's none headed by a woman. Most of them have very few women. And I just feel that if you had women sitting at the table, this issue would be taken more seriously. I can give you an example because in Iraq, I went to the arrested a lot of ISIS fighters in Iraq after the caliphate fell in 2019. And so they've been carrying out all these cases. It's not kind of justice like we would really recognize. They sentence people to death within 20 minutes. But I sat for a day watching these cases, and every single person was being tried for terrorism. So in a break, I spoke to the Chief Justice and I said to him, did any of these people that you are putting on trial here today, did any of them take Yazidi women or girls as sex slaves? So he said, yeah, loads of them. So I said, well, why isn't that one of the charges? So he literally laughed at me. He said, why would we put that as a charge? These people also killed and tortured. And I'm like, but don't you understand that the women that this happened to, every woman I spoke to told me they would rather have died than go through this. But he just didn't understand at all. No. So.
No. We'll take some questions. Leah, do you want to start? And then William. Have we got microphones perhaps at the front? We'll spread them through the room.
Thank you. That was so interesting. And I was just finished reading, actually, coincidentally, Susan Sontag's essay on Regarding the Pain of Others, where she talks about war photography and the ethics of reproducing these images that reach a lot of people. And she's talking about the Spanish Civil War and then after. And the reach of these photos, it made me think, was really, really small compared to the reach of images and news and witness accounts in the internet era. And I was also thinking, she already touches on this, on the fact that somehow the impact of distribution of these images and these discussions has actually been the reverse of what people were hoping for. The more there is, the more indifference there is. Somehow we just get used to pain and we normalize it. And it's like you were just saying, people say, why would I worry about it? I see it, I notice it, something like that happening. So I was wondering whether you could say something about the ethics of, on the one hand, being the person who shares the pain, but from a position of relative privilege. And the other one about what you think the impact, whether this resonates with you, this reflection that it seems to me that there is actually more indifference now that we have more access to pain than when we had less of it.
No, they're both very good questions. I mean, I worried a lot about what I was doing because these people have gone through terrible things. The last thing I wanted to do was make them, re-traumatize them by making them retell the worst day of their lives. And so the way I did it was, I never there's a famous book years ago by a British journalist called Anyone Here Been Raped and Speaks English, which is supposed to be having gone to, I think that was the Belgian Congo, and a journalist asking that of people. So I did not do that. I went to organizations, so I spoke to counselors, medical organizations, legal organizations representing some of the women, and asked them, I'm working on this issue, and would any of the people you're working with like to tell their story? So everybody I spoke to had volunteered to come and talk to me. And I made very clear to all of them, if you feel uncomfortable at any point, let's, you know, stop. You don't need to do this. And interestingly, I mean, I spoke to hundreds of people. Only one person actually decided it was too difficult. But I did it with a lot of time, so because these stories are really hard to tell, and you know, sometimes take days, and I, where I could, did it with also a psychologist being there, who they knew. But afterwards, I then worked with some of the survivors to try and come up with a way of what is the best way to tell their stories, because all of these people felt that it was important for their stories to come out, because otherwise things wouldn't change. But they didn't like how journalists were doing it. So we tried to come up with sort of guidelines of the best way to do it. And so that on that issue, that's what we did. But it, you know, my job always, that there is this issue, like, are you somehow, by exposing people's stories, you're kind of prying into something that is very personal, and so it can be very uncomfortable. And I just always, in my case, always really make sure that people really understand what it is I'm doing. And things have changed, because as you mentioned with the internet now, if I write someone's story, it's not just going to appear in my paper, the Sunday Times. People, for the rest of their lives, they can Google it. And so, but of course, you know, most of the people I spoke to, we didn't use their names.
But are we becoming inured to the pain?
The second question is, yeah, that's also something I worry about a lot, because we're living through a time of so much conflict, and I feel like people just, you know, we write about so many atrocities, and I really worry that people don't take notice anymore because they just got used to it. And I don't see the same kind of reaction to horrific things I write about that I might have seen 10 years ago. And so I do think that we have become inured. And I also feel that a lot of things are not being covered because we can't reach all, we don't have the capacity to cover all these things. So personally, I feel very strongly about Afghanistan. It's where I started as a journalist, and I've gone back and forth for 36 years. My heart breaks at what has happened to women and girls there. The fact that it's the only place on earth where girls can't go to high school, and that now even women can't speak in public. And the international community doesn't seem to know what to do. So that, and it's also kind of dropping out of the news. It's like 3 years ago when the Taliban first took over, people were outraged at this, but now I think people just almost moved on, and it's hard.
Yeah. I think William, and then lady in the middle. We'll work our way back.
In the UK over the last few days, a story has broken that the former owner of Harrods was systematically raping his employees over decades, and that despite the fact that the police were informed over and over again, they failed to prosecute him, which makes one fear, you know, and if this can't be achieved with Harvey Weinstein or whatever in peaceful societies, how are you going to make that cope in the Congo?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things when I started looking into this, I realized we have such a low conviction rate in the UK for rape. Only about 2% of rapes that are reported actually lead to anybody being prosecuted. So if that is the case in a country like the UK, of course, when people are living in a remote place or in a place where there's war, or people don't have the access to media or lawyers, how on earth do they have any hope of getting justice? So it is, rape is a crime which is really not being prosecuted enough at the moment, everywhere.
Lady in the middle.
Yeah, I have a question. I think we don't speak about rape, especially because we don't speak about the kind of war we are observing today. I see that in all wars today, the opponents don't fight their armies, they fight the civilians of the opponent. So in the end, every war on this planet in the moment is war crime from the very beginning. And rape is one instrument of war crime, and therefore women are raped, children are raped, and also men are raped, because it's war against the civilians. And what do you do with the civilians? They have no weapons, so you go against them, really body by body.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. If you look now at war today compared, say, to the First World War, the percentage of civilians being killed, it's completely turned around. So it is massively civilians who are the victims. And partly that's been because wars have been fought in more urban areas, but also, sadly, see what's happening in Gaza. Civilians just are not being protected as they are supposed to be.
We'll take the gentleman at the back and then move over to the left. Yeah, the gentleman there at the right.
Thank you for your very comprehensive coverage of your title, which was, of course, Women and War. I would welcome your thoughts about perhaps another subject which has equal depth. And let me just think of perhaps women and religion, or perhaps women and God. And a quick reference, look at the way in which, I hope I don't offend anyone, the Roman Catholic Church treats its women as certainly lesser mortals in the scheme of things. And of course, other major religions do that. And then you did briefly mention the Taliban and how they treat women, but when you read anything about this, you understand they believe they're fulfilling God's will, God's wish. So how in this grand scheme of things does God fit? And I'd very welcome your similar, clear, concise, erudite account of how you see that. Thank you.
Well, I think women and religion is probably another talk on its own, but the fact is that some of these people carrying out rape in these different conflicts are doing it for religious reasons. As I said, it's different reasons. Sometimes it's reasons of ethnicity, sometimes it's economic reasons, but certainly in the case of the Yazidis by Islamic State, they regarded them as devil worshippers. They told their fighters, it is your religious duty to go and take these women. They even published pamphlets about, how you should treat your sabiya, your slave, and that you can look at other examples. The Pakistan Army in Bangladesh in 1970 in the war there, again, they were told it was their religious duty to go and rape women. So, religion has been used. But in terms of the Taliban, I think it's a version of Islam that very few people would recognize outside the Taliban. There is no Islamic country on earth where girls cannot go to school or women work. We may differ in how women are treated in some of those countries. I could talk to you at length about women in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran. But, they certainly can, in fact, in Iran, more women are at university than men. So the Taliban's view of Islam is extremely warped view. The very first word in the Quran is knowledge, and So, but I think that we underestimated when the Taliban took over quite what they were. There was a lot of discussion then of whether the Taliban had changed, whether this was Taliban 2.0. And I think that we've clearly seen over the last 3 years that the Taliban have not changed. They've done exactly what they did before. And just as an aside, when the Taliban first took over, I was in Afghanistan about 2 weeks afterwards, and I was staying in a hotel, and most of the other reporters that were there were only a few of us, were women. And so we were staying in this hotel, and there was a buffet every evening. And so because we were just a small group, there weren't not many people, we stopped covering our heads in the buffet. And so it was myself, Lise Doucet from the BBC, Lindsay Hilson from Channel 4, there was a female journalist from France, and Susanna, the Washington Post reporter. So it was like 6 women, and I think there was 1 male reporter. And the manager came to us one day very embarrassed, and he said that the Taliban commander had come to him and said that these women are not covering their head in the buffet, and it offends me. So he said, you must all cover your head. And apparently the commander had literally said to the hotel manager, we did not fight for 20 years so that women could wander around with their heads uncovered. So.
I'm being asked to wrap up, but I'd like to take 2 more questions perhaps from this side, from any ladies here in particular. I have 2 at the front. Do you want to do those? I'm sorry to the gentleman at the back. Oh, there's a lady at the back who wants a question too? Let's take the lady at the back as well then. Just take the lady here with the red hair. Thank you. And if we can give a microphone to the lady at the back, who I didn't quite spot. Do we have a second microphone? Could we give that to the lady over there, please? Thank you.
Right, that's...
I'm going to take both questions, and then we can finish
is
off.
obviously a question. And the question really is, and you know, I've also covered rape as a weapon war as a photographer. But one of the things that always struck me in women that were interviewed was the shame that they bring to their family and not wanting to come forward. But I've heard so universally, the thing that the topic of the legal system and how they're protected. For example, in Uganda, Museveni has a law that a woman has to produce 2 witnesses to a rape. And the legal system, not just for the women that are raped during war, I think the legal system on the global stage fails women. And what you said very well about, it wasn't a mishappening that there was a woman judge that was actually, where can we go forward from here that we have representation in the legal system that really can help these women that are so vulnerable and have been in so much pain?
Thank you. Lady at the back.
Do you hear me? Yes. I wanted to thank you for bringing in this perspective of Germany being a leader on the treatment of this topic. As I'm sure you are very aware, the current foreign minister and her cabinet, they have been working on this policy called the feminist foreign policy. When she came out with this idea, I don't think it made her very popular with the people. Actually, the word feminist, even in liberal democracies in Western Europe, carries a certain charge, and many people were wondering, what do women want now? Fast forward to today, a lot has been worked on. However, as I'm hearing from colleagues at the Bundestag in Berlin, I myself work at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. It seems that the policy is going to be put lower on the agenda or either entirely dropped, because one of the reasons that has been brought up is that not enough has been done to engage even bigger actors such as maybe the US, especially ahead of elections in November, to possibly do as well something on this topic. What does it say about the state of the world if such actors as Germany, the US, and other powerful countries seem to be making 2 steps forward and 1 step back on the matter? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Nick, earlier the UK, which was the first country anywhere to have a department in its foreign ministry specifically for the prevention of sexual violence in conflict. It was quite a big department at one point. I think it had about 60 people. And now I think there's maximum 2 people working on it. And they seem to be doing other things as well. So, and, you know, William Hague, a man who started this, he said to me he raised this issue at every bilateral when he was Foreign Secretary. And almost all those bilaterals were with other men. And they constantly said to him, why are you talking about this? This is a woman's issue. And he said, look, if 99% of the perpetrators are male, this is actually a male issue. And also it's a national security issue. It affects all of it. So, but unfortunately that he then stopped being Foreign Secretary, and subsequent Foreign Secretaries have been less interested in doing this. So I do think that having that kind of heft, having somebody, so like the German Foreign Secretary, or of course, you know, when Kamala Harris became Vice President, I thought, oh, this is going to be good, because her background in California had been a prosecutor. She'd been very much involved in prosecuting rape and getting rape kits to people, but she, you know, just went silent on the issue when she became Vice President, and I haven't heard or seen her, you know, talk about this at all. So that is disappointing. And, you know, I personally feel we have to raise this issue at every possibility. And Carol, what you're talking about, the justice, we have to have more women judges. I think it's quite straightforward, but, and more women prosecutors, more women peacekeepers and peace negotiators. And every country should be striving much more to try and achieve that. And just one thing, because the lady that asked a question earlier over there, you mentioned about it happening to men too, and of course you're right, you know, it doesn't just happen to women, it happens much more to women than men, but with men it's even more taboo, and it's very hard for them to talk about what happened.
Christina, thank you very much.
Thank
you
you.
Also, I should say. I wanted to say thank you, not just, I think, for your physical bravery in doing what you do, but I think also for the moral courage, because I think that in particular is something, I hope not unique, but I think is something very special that you bring to this.
Thank you.